we have in the world this thing called the World Trade Organization. At the end of World War II, a whole bunch of countries in the world signed an agreement called GATT, which is the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. And the point of GATT was to get rid of tariffs and get rid of these trade barriers, and it was highly successful at doing that. So we had a dramatic reduction in tariffs and trade barriers around the world, an explosion of trade, and much of that was due to this GATT agreement. In 1994, the GATT changes and calls itself the World Trade Organization. Okay, and that's their cute little logo over there, the World Trade Organization. The WTO's mission is to encourage free trade around the world, and they actually have this kind of court system where countries can bring complaints against other countries. Right? And we'll talk about that. We already actually sort of talked about it because the U.S. goes there all the time to complain about Airbus, and European countries come to it all the time to complain about Boeing. So again, what does it do? Its job is to stimulate international trade. Now, the developed countries of the world say, yes, this WTO is a great thing, it's encouraging free trade, it's blah, blah, blah. There are large groups of protesters whenever there's big meetings about the WTO. And the reason there's a large group of protesters is many people argue that that's not really what the WTO does. They argue that what the WTO does is allow the large companies, it's designed to set up the big countries and big companies. So the US and Canada and Japan and Western European countries, and the system is designed to let their companies exploit the poor countries. So the lesser developed countries in the world, instead of the system being set up to help them become richer and more prosperous, where the WTO is the man, and it's keeping down these little countries and helping out the big countries. Okay? And that's not the purpose of this class to go through that. When you become an econ major, you can go take more econ and study all that. If you want, you can go to WTO website, and then you can go to websites of anti-WTO folks, and you can read both sides of that argument. Now, here in 2020, it might be that the WTO is actually just irrelevant. So President Trump doesn't care about the WTO. He's said, we're leaving, sort of. Many other countries in the world don't care. China, we got China into the WTO. The major job losses that happened between the U.S. and China, from the United States to China, happened in a very short period of time, and it was right after the U.S. got China in the WTO. China didn't technically really qualify to be in, but the United States helped them out and got them into the WTO. And that's when this huge, as Ross Perot, who ran for president years ago, said, a giant sucking sound happened, and all these jobs got sucked out of the United States and went to China. Most of the job losses from the U.S. to China happened in a very short period of a few years, and it was right after the World Trade Organization let China in. And the number of economists have studied this and concluded that, yes, in fact, that's the turning point, because it limited what the U.S. could do to China. So President Trump doesn't want to follow the WTO rules. Not following him, does his own thing. Okay? China now doing its own thing, not following the WTO rules, which it didn't sort of follow before. Anyhow, the World Trade Organization might be irrelevant in the modern world. Just saying. All right. So most countries engage, in fact, probably every country in the world engages some amount of what we call protectionism. That's protecting itself or its businesses from trade from other countries. Why? What's the arguments? Well, one is saving jobs. If the United States put high taxes on clothing imports in the United States, we could still have a clothing industry in the United States. Consumers would pay a lot more for clothes. but we'd have more of a clothing industry in the United States. So protectionism can be used to save jobs. We can keep steel mills from going out of business. We can keep car companies from going out of business. General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler, between them, used to be 85% of the American car market. Now they're not even 30% of the American car market. General Motors by itself was 65% of the U.S. car market. Now it's under 15% of the U.S. car market. Okay? So protectionism can save jobs. If you have free trade, you may lose jobs. Number two, wages in the U.S. tend to be higher than wages other places. Tariffs protect. That's the theory, protect. And their economists, if you want to get economists in an argument, find a couple of economists on different sides of this fence and have a nice argument. But if wages are really low in Vietnam and they're high in the U.S., there's an argument that U.S. companies are going to have trouble competing against Vietnamese companies that have much lower wages. Same with China. China has much lower wages. We have trouble competing. Okay? So you can put tariffs in place that counteract the effects of the difference in wages. The probably oldest tariff argument, and Alexander Hamilton was a huge proponent of this argument. So at the founding of the United States, the first Secretary of the Treasury really believed in this argument, and the U.S. had lots of tariffs for many years specifically because of this. The infant industry argument. If we want to start up an industry in the United States, if we say, okay, it's 1783 and there's no clothing manufacturers in the United States, and we want to build our own clothing industry in the United States, how do we do that? The existing companies in England that we're buying from and in France that we're buying from, it's going to be very hard to compete against them. So what do? We put a tariff on those imports. That means that the U.S. companies that are starting up, they're going to be inefficient. Their prices are going to be high when they're starting. We protected them, and now they can start up and not be driven out of business by the European competitors. The counter argument to that is people say infant industries never grow up. If they're protected all their lives, and you know friends whose parents, protected them, and when parents step away, then those kids get all crazy and they don't know how to act. If you constantly are protecting this industry, when can you stop? And when are they ready for you not to protect them? All right? Good question? Okay. National security. In the pandemic crisis and around here, we've noticed things. Antibiotics come from China. Maybe our national security says that we should make antibiotics in the United States and not just be dependent on China for them. In fact, lots and lots of drugs, the basic ingredients come from India. So even though we produce the drug in the United States, the chemicals for it come from India. Maybe there's a national security interest in being able to produce those things inside the United States. Okay? Cobalt is in every battery you have. Every battery you have uses cobalt as part of the mechanism of the battery. Okay, it's in your car batteries. If you own a hybrid or an electric car, a lot of cobalt in there. All your electronic devices, your phone, they all have cobalt in them. Well, China owns 80% of the cobalt mines in the world and growing. They keep buying them. Maybe it's in our security interest to do something about that. Okay? I'm not saying it is, but these are arguments that we've been hearing lately and that should be discussed. And then the last thing is what's called dumping. Dumping means what happened to the wheat farmers in Africa. What happens if the Chinese want to infiltrate a market here in the United States? They want to get into a market here in the United States. And to do it, they start out by selling things below the cost of making them. Well, U.S. companies are not going to be able to compete. That's called dumping, right? They sell the product below the cost of making it with the intent of wiping out the local competition. And then once the local competition is gone, then they jack the price way up. Okay? It's not just other countries that do that. Walmart's famous for doing that. Standard Oil in the 100 years ago was accused of doing it. Okay? Yeah, it happens. Okay. So we're engaged in a trade war. Over time, we've often been engaged in trade wars. What do we know about trade wars? So trade wars are never good for consumers. Consumers always pay the cost of a trade war, consumers in your country. Businesses in a trade war, there are winners and losers from businesses. There's always trade-offs. So you engage in a trade war because what's our issues with China? Well, we have problems with intellectual property, right? They steal our patents, they steal our intellectual property, they use our intellectual property without paying us and without our permission. Okay? That's a problem. Number two, we buy a lot more of their stuff than they buy from our stuff. And China has a formal government policy of trying to get their citizens to buy stuff from them to develop their industries. Okay? Kind of the infant industry thing. So we have certain specific industries that are being hurt by what we believe or what we argue is anti-competitive practices from China. That we don't have a problem if we're, competing with them on a fair basis, but when they're, manipulating their exchange rate and doing all these other things and stealing our intellectual property, that's a problem. Okay? On the other hand, and that's the economist thing, right? There's an old economist joke. And no matter what you major in, there are jokes in your major that only people who are in your major think are funny. Right? A neutron walks into a bar, says to the bartender, "How much are drinks here?" And the bartender says, "For you, no charge." Neutron, right? No charge, neutron. Okay. So there's an old economist joke that there's a king, and one day he just gets fed up and turns to his advisors and say, "Find every economist in the country and cut off their left hand." And the guys are like, what? And the king goes, "I can't stand it when they always say, 'on the other hand.'" Okay, fine. On the other hand, U.S. farmers were selling tons of stuff to China. Most of the soybeans being bought in China were U.S. soybeans. Okay? U.S. farmers making a lot of money selling stuff to China. There wasn't a farm problem. We were selling them lots and lots and lots and lots of farm stuff. All right? So we put tariffs on to try to fix the problems between us and China in trade. Okay? There's other things we could have done, other approaches we could have taken, but we put tariffs on. Okay? The president says trade wars are easy to win, quick and easy to win, which turned out not to be the case. In the last 2 years, in 2018 and 2019, a record number of family farms in the United States went bankrupt. The Trump administration the U.S. consumers paid close to $20 billion in tariffs. U.S. consumers paid $20 billion in taxes, not China. China didn't pay a dime in tariffs. U.S. consumers paid this. The Trump administration took this money and gave it out to farmers, but mostly they gave it out to the big corporate farmers and not to the little family farms. And we had record numbers of family farms go bankrupt. So the farms were doing fine. They didn't have a problem. But because we went after one group of Chinese businesses, the Chinese came after our farmers, and instead of buying U.S. soybeans, they're buying Brazilian soybeans and soybeans from other countries. U.S. farmers are going bankrupt. Okay? On the other hand, the new agreements we've made with China and Mexico, once they get all approved, and they're not approved yet, but once they get all approved, there's protections in there for intellectual property. There are things that are good for certain other industries in. So we've damaged the farm sector, and we've helped this other sector. Nothing is ever free. There are always trade-offs. We helped one sector, we hurt another. And the decision of whether or not that was a good choice is a political decision, not economists don't sit there and go, "Hey, yeah." We're like, this is what happened. Right? Positive economics. We believe in positive theory. Positive theory means we tell you what happened. Normative theory, we leave that to the politicians, whether we should have done this or not, whether it was the right thing. So you damage some industries, you help other industries. Consumers paid a lot more for the stuff they bought. Good or bad? All right? We can tell you the effects. Economists tell you the effects of it.